Thank you. Good evening. How's everybody doing this evening? Good, good. Well, it's wonderful to be here at the Asia Society of Texas. Thank you, Marty, for that introduction. I also want to thank Bona and the Asia Society for organizing this event, and Marty, Charles, and Mickey for all the support they've given to this important organization. I mentioned earlier to a few people that so much of the thought about Asia and even other parts of the world seems to come out of Washington, D.C. or New York or places like Los Angeles and San Francisco, and it's important and valuable to have this incredible gem. So thank you to the Asia Society for all of the work that you do. We're eternally grateful. I represent my hometown of San Antonio in the United States Congress. I have the main San Antonio district, and for those of you that may think that I look familiar, you may have actually met my twin brother, Julian. I have a twin brother that was mayor of San Antonio for about 5.5 years and then served in President Obama's cabinet as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development for about 2.5 years. My brother and I are twins, but in case you do meet him and you wonder how to tell us apart, just remember that I'm the better looking one. And when you see him, you'll know that that's true. In the House of Representatives, I have the privilege of serving on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Through the Foreign Affairs Committee, I have the opportunity to guide U.S. policy on a number of issues, including human rights, security challenges, and economic engagement around the world. I'm also co-founding chair of the U.S.-Japan Caucus and the Congressional Caucus on ASEAN. Each a group of members interested in deepening the U.S.-Japan relationship or the relationship between the United States and the nations of Southeast Asia. The United States relationship with the peoples and nations of Asia touches our lives every day, as you all know. Americans every day interact with in some form with Asia through the foods we eat, the people we meet, entertainment we consume, the cars we drive, and in many other meaningful ways. The United States is fortunate to count so many Asian nations as close allies and valued partners, relationships critical to safeguarding the lives of people here in the United States and around the world. These relationships are a reflection of a shared vision between partners of a region governed by rules and laws. Many of you are business owners. Many of you work with companies either based in Asia or with significant interest in the Asian markets. In some way, each of us is directly affected by the economic relationship between the United States and countries in Asia, including Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and many others. This complex and deep relationship will, of course, have difficulty at times. There could be disputes between companies, differences in interpretation of a trade agreement, or even territorial dispute. A region based on rules allows disputes between businesses, between countries, to be settled in courts and meeting rooms with the help of ink and dialogue, not on the oceans and beaches with guns and swords. The United States has worked with our partners across the Pacific Ocean to promote such a vision and to set its institutional foundations. For example, we supported the nations of Southeast Asia's efforts to promote regional governance through ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. ASEAN represents a commitment to cooperation, not conflict, and has significantly enhanced the fruits of U.S. engagement in the region. The stability and predictability of such a system is why Texas is the top exporting state in the United States, with over 1 million jobs reliant on our exports. That's something as a state that we can all be very proud of. Japanese companies invest in car manufacturing, high-speed rail, semiconductors, and even convenience stores. Texas and Australians collaborate closely in energy, construction, and agriculture. Examples of this relationship between both sides of the Pacific Ocean are present in our daily lives and are enabled by a rules-based order. All of you know, though, that over the past year, there have been some serious threats to our international security. You know that there's been a situation developing on the Korean Peninsula over the past year, a conflict. A war on the Korean Peninsula would threaten the peace and stability that has led to so much prosperity in the United States. millions in Korea and Japan would be at risk, including hundreds of thousands of American citizens and service members who live there. The United States itself would also be placed at risk if such a war were to escalate. I believe that it's important that the administration, the Trump administration, invest in diplomacy, in achieving an interim agreement that freezes North Korea's weapons development while working towards an ultimate agreement to denuclearization. I'm confident the United States can rise to this challenge, in large part due to the support of our allies in the Asia region. For decades, the United States has maintained close and mutually beneficial relationships with South Korea, Japan, Australia, Singapore, and other partners in the region. These relationships are based on a mutual commitment to a global order based on rules and have strong support in the United States and in the societies of these partners. The actions of the administration and its allies over the last year have raised a lot of questions over the credibility of the United States in Asia, though. The President's actions, for example, in withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, in challenging the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement at such a sensitive time, and in threatening war through tweet, is not reflective of how the American people feel, but is heard and considered in the capitals of both our allies and our rivals. If their confidence in our ability to lead falters, we will see an unraveling of the network of alliances that the United States has benefited from for decades. The President's rhetoric to Mexico during sensitive NAFTA renegotiations has also concerned me. I know we're speaking obviously about a southern neighbor in another part of the world, but it's been indicative of the President's approach. I believe updating NAFTA is a welcome move. New technologies like the internet, since the agreement was first put into place, and the changing composition of North America's economy means a renegotiated NAFTA could be very productive for American citizens and business owners. I fear, though, that the President's domestic rhetoric towards undocumented workers, the border wall, and his international position towards Mexico, including demands that they pay for a wall, or certain language proposals for NAFTA, lead to a toxic renegotiation environment. Getting NAFTA renegotiation right is extremely important for Texas, as you know. Texas exports more than any other state in the country, and many Texas businesses have large operations across our southern border and rely on offices on both sides of the Rio Grande to support those businesses. A successful NAFTA renegotiation that helps American workers and business owners will require a constructive relationship with Mexico and Canada, built on decades of mutual cooperation and not coercion by tweet. Events like the one we're at here today are important. U.S. engagement with Asia is so much more than meetings at the Security Council or residences of ambassadors. Each year, hundreds of billions of dollars in trade and hundreds of thousands of students transit the Pacific Ocean. Millions of Americans can trace their ancestors to Asia, just as hundreds of thousands of Americans live in Korea, Japan, and other parts of the Asia region. Each of these interactions brings our societies closer and is underpinned by our diplomatic investments into our Asia partners that promotes mutual prosperity. I ask each of you, when you have conversations with political leaders, both in the United States and in Asia, with business leaders and with our fellow citizens, to emphasize the value of diplomacy and our continued partnership with our allies in Asia. We enjoy the fruits of this peace, and I imagine we would all regret it if it were to vanish. Thank you again for having me here. Thank you to the Asia Society for all of your work, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Okay. So I was thinking when I was going to start this conversation that when I got out, like you, I got out of law school, I more or less spoke Spanish. I started a job in New York, and the first thing I started working on were matters involving Asia, China specifically, and I've been involved with China ever since. How, as a native San Antonian from the west side, how did you wind up focusing on Asia as much as you have?
That's a great question. You know, it's kind of a more roundabout route. You know, I grew up in San Antonio, and I grew up in a part of San Antonio that's probably 90% Mexican American. For those of you that are familiar with the geography of San Antonio, I grew up on the deep West Side and went to Jefferson High School, and then my brother and I both got into Stanford University and went there in 1992, came out in 1996, and then went over to law school and came back home. And I spent, shortly after getting back home, about a year after I got back home, I ran for my first office. I ran for state representative in San Antonio. And I was elected, but in the state legislature, you don't deal much with foreign affairs. Now, I was, for a few terms, I was on the Border International Affairs Committee, but that's both basically Texas's relationship with Mexico, because you're dealing with border issues. It's not much beyond that. So when I got to Congress, to answer your question, this had always been an interest for me. Foreign affairs, international affairs had always been an interest of mine, but I'd really not had a chance to spend time on it. So I resolved that when I went to Congress, that's something that I would do. And my assignments immediately when I got to Congress were the Armed Services Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee. And in 2013, there were a group of folks who came to me, and they knew that Toyota, years before, had made a very significant investment in San Antonio, and Mayor Henry Cisneros, for quite a while, had actually laid a strong foundation for Japanese investment in San Antonio. And of course, there's significant Japanese investment in other parts of Texas. But they asked me, they said, you know, there's never been a Japan caucus, a U.S.-Japan caucus. There's a U.S.-Japan study group in the Congress, but they said there's never been a caucus. Would you be interested in being one of the co-founders of starting this caucus? So that was about going on 4.5 years. And so that was my first entry into really delving into these issues. And then, of course, we started the U.S. ASEAN caucus about a year ago in January.
Well, then I was going to ask you about ASEAN. I sort of figured Japan was, I sort of associated to Toyota.
Yeah, a lot of the economic investment.
But ASEAN is something of interest to me. I've served as the Honorary Consul General of Thailand. What was your focus? What led you to that caucus?
Well, we've been building up the U.S.-Japan caucus, and it really hit its height around the time of the TPA-TPP debate, and we got up to 100 members at the time. And we still have a significant number of members, not quite as many now, but still a lot. And during that time, as I did my work on foreign affairs, I tried to figure out, as I've tried to do in other ways in policy, you know, where are the gaps? Where are there missing pieces in what I'm not seeing here in Congress? And one of those missing pieces was ASEAN. Obviously a very important part of the world, an emerging part of the world as an economic, you know, cooperative, so to speak. But again, there was no caucus there to really, and the caucus is a way for the U.S.-Japan caucus, as Consul General Manos here knows, it's been a way for members of the U.S. Congress, particularly in the House of Representatives, but also in the Senate, to engage more with members of the Diet. So we've had a huge increase in the number of visits between the two countries of legislators. So we tried to set up the same thing, myself and Ann Wagner, who's a Republican from Missouri, for the U.S. ASEAN countries. And that's been quite an adventure as well.
Good. Well, you already alluded to maybe one of the big issues in U.S.-Asian relations, and that was right off the bat, the president followed through with his campaign promise to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And some would say not only from the partnership, but from Asia, just while the Obama administration had pivoted toward Asia. So give us your thoughts about how that has impacted our relations, the views, particularly economically.
It's interesting because on the one hand, it wasn't a big surprise, I think, to either Americans or folks in Japan or any of the partner countries. People were able to listen to the president's rhetoric during the campaign. So in a sense, it wasn't a surprise. But I went to Japan in February of 2017, and there were two big questions at the time, because I went back for the Mount Fuji dialogue later in October. But the two big questions that I got at the time, number one, is America, some form of the question, is America still committed to being a leader among nations in the world, and in this region in particular? So it felt to them like a retrenchment, a pulling back. The second question I got was who reliably speaks for the president? Which is true on a lot of different issues, both domestic and foreign. But you could tell that, at least in Japan, I don't want to speak more broadly, but they were really trying to sort out, are we still marching to an American beat in some way, right? China's been very aggressive with RCEP, for example. They've tried to deeply engage with the Southeast Asian nations. Where Davos is going on right now, you remember a year ago, Xi Jinping went to Davos and essentially tried to step out as a new global leader, and there was this kind of quiet talk about how maybe the Chinese president, rather than the American president, is the new leader on some of these big issues.
So in part, the president said he was withdrawing because he didn't like multilateral deals and he favored bilateral deals. But in fact, where are we? As far as you know, are we negotiating bilateral trade agreements in the region?
No, I haven't seen any evidence that there's anything that's far along. I know there was a question which was basically resolved yesterday for about a year, whether you would have TPP 11, in other words, whether the remaining countries would move forward without the United States, and it looks like they have.
Yeah.
So there are significant questions about what the next American multilateral trade agreement looks like. What will that look like? The president was asked, I think yesterday, maybe a few days ago, about whether he'd be open to joining TPP at some point, and he said, well, it depends on what the deal looks like, right? So a question in my mind as I look at these issues is, what does the next American trade agreement look like?
Yeah, if there is one.
If there is one, yeah.
Well, the other big issue that you also mentioned that we cannot skip over, of course, is North Korea. So I wanted to explore that a little bit further. In the past few days, of course, there's been a apparent thaw between the North and South with the Olympics, and there's been more of an emphasis on economic sanctions. But there has been some very significant rhetoric saying that unless the North Korean regime gives up their nuclear program, that there has to be a military solution. And that seems, for many people, for all the reasons you alluded to, the loss of life.
Very dangerous.
So do you think we're heading in the right direction, that we're not, that the administration's not focused on a military solution?
Well, I can't say yes to that question. I can't say that they're not focused on a military solution.
Is there a good military solution?
At this point, it appears as though North Korea has nuclear capabilities, and the only question is how effectively and how far they can fire those missiles. For example, whether they can hit the mainland United States, whether they can hit Hawaii. But I'm pretty sure they can hit Japan and South Korea if they wanted to. So the danger is incredible. You're dealing basically with nuclear power at this point. There's a lot of frustration with this issue because many folks will argue that diplomacy failed. I would argue that our approach for the last many years has not been diplomacy, it was isolation, basically. And those are two different things. When the six-party talks failed, we basically moved into a period of isolation. Now, some people will come back and say, well, or at least imply, maybe we should have taken military action at the time. That point has bugged me enough so that I made a statement in the Foreign Affairs Committee where I basically said, well, let's go back to 2005, 2006, when we were knee-deep in two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The prospect that you were then going to go start a third war with North Korea, I think, is not very credible. The idea that either an administration, in that case the Bush administration, or that the American people were going to tolerate a third war simultaneously, I think is not realistic.
And of course, in terms of tolerate, there's also a question of how China would have reacted if we had initiated a war.
No, absolutely. And their position was interesting. There was a point earlier in the year, actually, it's 2018 now, a few months back, there was a point at which the relationship or the tension between North Korea and the United States felt the same way it feels when you're in school and you see two kids on the schoolyard who are nose to nose, who you feel are about to fight, and that somebody's going to throw a punch, and you're kind of recoiling because there's a lot of tension. To me, it got to a point where it felt like that. And then, it seems like there's been some backing away. And I'll say this publicly because I said it to the Secretary of State about 6 weeks ago. There have been other stories like this. Now there have been stories in the news about the United States building up for a potential military strike against North Korea. I spoke to a reservist in San Antonio at Lackland Air Force Base who told me that his deployment unit manager, a sergeant, had told him, this was in December, that they should be ready to activate for North Korea in March. Told him that you could basically, and I said, well, was he just pulling your chain, basically? Was he kidding with you? He said, no, this is the guy that tells us when we're going to go off, we're going to activate, and we're going to go somewhere. And I asked Secretary Tillerson about that. I said, are we getting ready to go to war with North Korea? And he gave me his answer, which he's done, about all options being on the table. Well, since then, there have been some other stories. I think The Guardian ran one, the New York Times ran one, about the military preparations for North Korea. So that's why I say I can't answer your question that this administration is not preparing for a military strike. I can't say that the answer is no.
Earlier we talked briefly about the impact of implementing THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area of Defense. Could you comment on that? Your thoughts?
Yeah, for the United States, we see it as an important element in defense against ballistic missiles. Of course, in South Korea with the new president, I was there just as President Park was, her presidency was nearing a tumultuous end. The approach from the new administration in South Korea has been a bit different, and I think they've kind of put a little bit of a hold, obviously, on the further deployment of the THAAD system. But, we've ramped up our military exercises with Japan and South Korea, with our allies there. And so the United States wants to make sure that we're prepared in case something breaks out. But the wisdom of a first strike, I think, is highly questionable on our part.
Besides those big two issues, the overarching issue seems to be the rise of China, economically, militarily. They've certainly, as you alluded to in your remarks, China, with the remarks of Xi Jinping at Davos last year, they're taking what many Chinese would believe the rightful place of the Chinese globally. How do you see our bilateral relations? Our fellow Houstonian, George Bush, for decades, it says that is our most important bilateral relation.
Yeah.
But we do have some sensitive issues. We have the trade issue, we have the South China Sea issue, but on the other hand, we're somewhat dependent upon China in so many ways.
No, you're right. I think China's our number one trading partner. Obviously, a big holder of our debt. Everybody knows that. So it's an incredibly important relationship that's fraught with a lot of complications and a lot of disagreements on big issues, and some of them that you mentioned. But I do think that the Trump administration and President Trump, in his approach to foreign policy and some of the language that he's used, has created a wider opening. There was already an opening for Xi Jinping and for China because they've been so aggressive. They've been able to marshal the resources of government into entrepreneurship and so forth. But widen that opening, I think, by, especially early on in his presidency, in the early months and while he was a candidate, starting to use language that would alienate some of our allies. So I mentioned Mexico when I made my remarks, but also there were skirmishes with Germany, with Angela Merkel. You remember when he wouldn't shake her hand. There was the berating of NATO and this idea that perhaps the United States would no longer be as fully committed to NATO. There was the issue with Australia and the Australian leader in the series of phone calls that he was making when he first took office. There have been tiffs with Canada and Justin Trudeau over different trade issues. And so as you do that, and I'll use Mexico again as the example of what I said back then. I said, look, he's saying Mexico's going to pay for the wall, and we're going to take away, if we have to, we'll take away foreign aid, for example. I think whatever you take away from Mexico,
in assistance, in whatever kind of assistance there is, whatever you take away from Mexico, I'm more than sure that Xi Jinping would be willing to give them whatever we take away. To do whatever Mexico needs. And you see that kind of commitment and relationship building going on from China, by China and by Xi Jinping, in Latin America, certainly with major projects in Africa, for example. And that's, as a nation, you know, I mean, and he's a leader of his nation. That's how you build the prominence of your nation across the world. And he's executed that.
Yeah, and also you're familiar with China's Belt and Road initiative.
Yeah, One Belt, One Road, yeah.
All across Asia,
That's
the
right.
old Silk Road. And I've also read that in many international forums today, China is extremely well represented, where often the U.S. representation is small or negligible in comparison.
Well, you know, we still haven't put in place, the administration has not put in place, a lot of people at the State Department. The attrition rate at the State Department is horrible. A lot of people are leaving, including long-standing career folks. We still are missing key ambassadorships, including in Asia. And so, yeah, I mean, it's been a challenge. You know, and I know that the administration is, you know, I'm trying to make the argument for them a little bit. I think committed to a more efficient government, a less costly government, smaller government, and so forth. But sometimes I think there is a real cost in terms of your diplomatic abilities and your ability to be seen as, again, a leader of nations around the world. When you are not fully represented and when issues are not getting addressed, or when you have on controversial issues, and this has been a big problem, Charles, I'm sure you know this, but on any controversial issue, you'll get 3 or 4 or 5 different answers out of the White House. Let me give you the one prime example of that. Last year, you remember the first time during the Trump administration that Prime Minister Netanyahu came to the United States, he and the president had a joint press conference, and at that press conference, there was an allusion to the United States shifting its position away from a 2-state solution and now moving it to a 1-state solution. And during that press conference, I believe, well, first, the Secretary of State was not there, but also the Secretary of State, I think, was flying somewhere else. And the next day, the UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, I think, had to come forward and say, no. You know, our position is still a 2-state solution, but we essentially want, what we want to happen is whatever the parties agree to, basically. That was one indication. The Rohingya issue also was another example of where you heard 2 separate things. Nikki Haley used language, you know, that was basically very tough, that called it ethnic cleansing. And then Rex Tillerson was asked about it, and he made a comment where he wouldn't use the terms ethnic cleansing, and also said that we had to have strategic patience, basically. So I think when leaders around the world come to believe that there isn't one solid principle or answer or, you know, approach that you've got, that really weakens your position. Because that's why in Japan they were asking the question, you know, we're hearing 2 or 3 different things. Who speaks for the president reliably?
You know, Congressman, one more thing that struck me recently. I was speaking to the Chinese ambassador. We were talking about something in Washington, and the question came up. And he says, well, we've got a, you know, we're focusing on a 50-year plan. Sometimes it appears to me in Washington it's hard to focus on what's going to happen.
But we don't even have a 5-day plan.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. That seems to me a huge problem. When, I mean, I think the rise of China is very important for the world, but it's also disturbing that sometimes the U.S. does not have that long-term strategic focus, or at least it appears that way.
No, you're right. I mean, especially in the last several years, this Congress has been very gridlocked. You know, democracy obviously is sometimes a messy thing, a good thing, but a messy thing. And so there does require a lot more interaction among people with differing views of the world and on these important issues. It just seems like in the last several years, the Congress has hit a new level of gridlock that's unhealthy both for the democracy and our relationship for nations in the world. I got there in 2013, and the term before I arrived, between January 2011, January of 2013, and then my first term there, 2013 to 2015, Those were the two least productive sessions in American congressional history, measured by the number of bills sent to the president's desk. I don't know where the last session stands. I haven't checked, but it just shows you that the wheels were basically coming to a grinding halt.
Yeah. Some people will frequently say the most dangerous place in the world is not just in the Korean Peninsula, but the Indian-Pakistani border. You have two nuclear powers with a great deal of tension. And of course the president...
Who have had skirmishes in the past, obviously.
Significantly.
Right.
And the president famously started this year with tweeting about Pakistan, saying that we're going to cut off our aid. There are some real issues we have there in Pakistan.
Yeah. No, I think it's absolutely fair to say that we need to be tough with Pakistan on helping us root out terrorism. That is true. At the same time, I think we need to be mindful of the role that foreign aid plays, both in relationship building, it also in maintaining a certain balance and order in that region. It's a tough issue. I mean, it's a tough one because it's true. I mean, I think there's cooperation that we would like to see from Pakistan and things we'd like to see from Pakistan that we don't.
You already talked about maybe I should say we talked about earlier, our friend Bill Richardson. Let's talk a little bit about Myanmar. He pulled out of that policy group to focus on the situation in Myanmar, and that seems to be very disappointing given the fact that we've been so supportive of the current leadership.
Yeah, I've spoken out, and several other folks in Congress have spoken out about the crisis, the human crisis there in Myanmar, and the ethnic cleansing that's gone on. You had hundreds of thousands of Rohingya who fled from Myanmar over to mostly Bangladesh, which was overwhelmed with, but to the credit of the nation, took folks in. But there has still so far been no solid plan that I've seen to try to curtail this atrocity. And I realize that there's a longer history than just the last 6 months or the last year. But, from the waffling of the administration's part in terms of language, there is a bill in Congress that would sanction individuals in the military, for example, there, but that has not moved. I'm one of the co-sponsors of it, but it hasn't moved. So I feel like in terms of human rights and the United States taking action there and marshaling the forces of the world, I haven't seen it.
And what a surprise, because we all love the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Aung San Suu Kyi.
Yeah.
And she's not living up to, I think, a lot of the expectation of the world community.
No, I think that's right. I think Aung San Suu Kyi, in her own right, was seen as a very inspirational leader in the country, and a Nobel winner. But also, I think part of the reason that the expectation was high that she would step in and really try to do something about what we've seen from the military there, and that has not happened. And as you and I were speaking earlier, that's part of the reason that Bill Richardson stepped back, because he didn't feel like the commission that had been put together was serious about really doing anything about this problem, and instead could be used as cover to just say, well, we've looked into it and it's not what people think and so forth. And Bill's a great guy. He was an incredible diplomat and ambassador over at the UN.
Focused on North Korea quite a bit.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, and Bill's been sent over by presidents on diplomatic missions even after he stopped his service. So a very strong diplomat and somebody who's been helpful to the United States in achieving peace in different places of the world. So when I saw that, when I read that, I was very alarmed. Yeah. And I was kind of surprised, too.
It made me think of something. We could pivot back to North Korea. I think the last leader that actually visited North Korea was Madeleine Albright. Sort of fascinating. The president has sort of indicates that he could be actually a friend of the North Korean leader and might even go meet him. That's sort of bizarre.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of that. Yeah. Sometimes he seems open, and then of course his language has been really hostile, and he's called him Little Rocket Man and so forth. You know, and as Charles and I were talking earlier, and I said, man, you know, I could really, because you try to imagine the argument on the other side, right? Like, what if you were working for Donald Trump, right? If you were working for Donald Trump, what argument would you make on behalf of the administration or on his behalf that his approach has been successful so far? And I guess if I had to make an argument, and I'll make it for him, but I guess if I was him, I would say, listen, you know, everybody thinks I'm crazy. You think I'm a madman. You think that everything I do is chaos. But this has been the first time that North and South Korea have talked like this and met like this in years. And he said a little bit of this, but I didn't think really in a polished way. You know, this is the first time they've met in years, and this would not have happened but for my very strong-handed approach. And I know that it makes people uncomfortable. I know that a lot of people don't like it. I know people think it's risky, but look where we are, right? And because there hasn't been any kind of war, he can still say that, right? Now, if we do something stupid, or if he does something stupid, that won't be true. But you know, I've been surprised that the White House has not made a cogent argument to take credit for, you know, I've strongly disagreed with their approach in many ways, but I did give them credit for going to the UN, for example, and getting the strongest sanctions ever placed on North Korea. I thought that was a diplomatic victory. I thought they should be building on that rather than fighting it out over Twitter. But listen, you know, now that, I mean, North and South Korea have been talking, there is an argument for the president to make that there is some success in that approach, even though it seems very scattershot.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you, and I think obviously the twisting of the economic sanctions, but apparently you read that the Chinese and the Russians are still violating that. And that's probably too broad to say the Chinese and the Russians, but there are companies that are doing so. Yeah. But I'm reminded how difficult it is difficult to protect that. We, the U.S., we cannot control everything that comes into the U.S. We cannot stop the flow of drugs, so sometimes that's difficult to do.
Yeah. No, you're right, and China has said, for example, that it's hard for them to control every single undercover business, basically, that's going out there and doing trades and stuff, or doing business, basically, in North Korea. But our success in applying diplomatic pressure and economic pressure rests in their cooperation, because they make up such an incredible 80% or more of the economy of North Korea, trade with China.
Let's go back. I wanted to stay with ASEAN, since you're on the ASEAN caucus and it's made of Southeast Asian countries. I have to say this, having represented Thailand here, do you have any particular views on how U.S.-Thai relations are doing at this moment? Have you followed that?
A little bit. You know, it's interesting with ASEAN because there have been these big issues. You know, some of the nations, for example, have had territorial issues with China, and as we mentioned, the South China Sea and everything that's been going on there. So that's been a big issue that we've been working on and following. Of course, the Rohingya issue, the issue in the Philippines with Duterte and the extrajudicial killings has been something in terms of human rights that many of us have spoken out about. You know, but in terms of Vietnam, Thailand, and the other nations, we want to make sure that the United States that they are productive partners for us economically, that they're strong allies in the region, but also that we're able to call them out when we believe that human rights are being violated. So for Thailand and for all of the nations, that's kind of been our approach, is basically make sure that we create a forum so that there is more dialogue between their legislators and ours, that we strengthen economic relationships. But when we see a violation like the Rohingya issue, it's hard. You can't just not say anything because you're part of the ASEAN caucus. In fact, I think you have a greater responsibility at that point to speak out. In that sense, this caucus has been more challenging than the U.S.-Japan caucus because you have, obviously, it's a multi-nation group with ASEAN, so you've got thornier issues that have come up.
A lot of people don't realize that we're all aware of how big the China market is, but if you take the aggregate ASEAN market, it's just equals virtually China. But I'll say something personally. I spent a few years trying to stay out of Vietnam, and yet my law office is open an office in Ho Chi
all
Minh
right.
City. So that to me is one of the big surprises, the growth, how Vietnam has really pivoted and sort of, to a great extent, following the China model.
Yeah, it's incredible. I was there myself, Beto O'Rourke, and a few others, Senator Carper from Delaware. We were with President Obama when he went in May of 2016. And it was amazing to see how far the country has come. And President Obama was so incredibly well received by the people of Vietnam. So you could tell on the streets, literally, it was like, it really was in some parts what you see old film of when President Kennedy or other presidents are going down, the street. Just an incredible outpouring of support. Yeah. You could tell the strength of the relationship.
Yeah, really amazing considering the devastating war we had.
Oh yeah, no.
So I'm getting a sign over there pretty soon. I'm going to wrap up, but I want to. You mentioned your brother, and how to tell.
He's uglier, yeah.
Between you, but I understand he may have some plans.
Yeah, well, you'll have to ask him for a definitive answer. Yeah. But yeah, my brother, after he left HUD, he's between San Antonio and Austin, and he's over at the LBJ school teaching and also finishing up a book for Little Brown. He's talked about running for president in 2020 with about 50 other Democrats. It'd be a crowded field, but of course I'll support him in whatever he does, and I think he's got an incredible future.
Yeah, so there's a lot of speculation on what both of you will do.
Yeah.
Eventually.
Well, I'm running for re-election, so.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, nobody here can vote for me.
Well, we know you come to Houston frequently. We're glad you're back here. We hope to see you again. And I think it's time we can start taking some questions from the audience. So, who has the first question? Alan.
Yes.
Congressman, two questions.
Yeah.
Number one, the administration has punted the Iran nuclear deal supposedly back to Congress to play a role. As someone that supports the deal, I'm very concerned with congressional involvement in this deal, and I'd like for your comments on it. The second question is, you mentioned Russia, but we have to somehow have diplomacy with Russia. It's very important. This administration is going to find it very difficult with the probes going on to conduct a normal policy. From your observations on the committee, what kind of policy or what kind of role do you see Congress in helping to shape Russia?
On Russia policy, man, that's a good but tough question. The first part on the Iran deal, I still believe, and of course I could be wrong because, with this administration, things can change quickly, this Congress. But I still believe that the U.S. will remain, that the deal will remain in effect. I don't see it going, I don't see it changing, I don't see it going anywhere in a significant way. The purpose of the deal, and I supported it also, was to keep a denuclearized Iran. And by all accounts, by the studies, by the reports, by the inspections, that is what we have right now, a denuclearized Iran. And so unless that changes somehow, I think that we're going to stay where we are. That's my prediction. And again, there is a danger for any president in any administration that you have too many hot things going on in the world. And with North Korea going on, even though the president doesn't like it, but this issue with Russia that's been going on, there are a lot of hot things going on in the world, and I don't see the president. I don't know. Like I said, I could be wrong. I hope I'm not, but I don't see them making Iran another big, very hot spot. So, and then remind me your second question on Russia. Oh man. Well, I'm on the Intelligence Committee. So we're, it fundamentally changed my routine and my day in Congress because some of these interviews, are 5-7 hours. One of them was 10 hours. So, we're trying to get to the bottom about the scale of Russia's involvement in interfering with the American elections, and we know that they've interfered with other elections in other parts of the world. You're right, we need to have a diplomatic relationship with them. We don't want another Cold War. We certainly don't want to spark another World War. But I'll be honest, it's a tough balance because I do think that Vladimir Putin does have this idea about Russia becoming more aggressive in different parts of the world and not just doing it economically. You know, with Xi Jinping, a lot of it is economic relationships and projects in different countries and leveraging that as goodwill. With Russia, that's not the case so much because they don't have the same economy to work with. They don't have the same tool set, so to speak. So instead, they've got an incredibly talented cyber unit that they use basically as an influence mechanism. And that's what you see in different parts of the world. In fact, I think we sent the letter. We may have held off because of the shutdown. But there were reports about interference with the Mexican election, which is coming up later in the year. You know, and so we know Ukraine has had issues in other places. So their approach, I think, concerns us a great deal. But you're right. I mean, you've got to try to have as good a relationship as you can, but still address these very troubling issues about interference in the American democracy. That's tough to do.
Yes, I had a question. You mentioned the gridlock in Congress.
Yeah.
And that may be at the root of a lot of the problems that we have. And do you see any viable solution to that?
Yeah, they need to end gerrymandering. And I know that you said a viable solution. I actually think there's a Supreme Court case now that's been taken up, I think out of Wisconsin maybe, on the issue of gerrymandering. And in different parts, right? In different states where it's been challenged. But I don't believe that any politician should be drawing political districts any longer. I think that it's been pernicious for American democracy. You've seen it for years. You saw Democrats do it, including in states in the South, including in Texas. Now you see Republicans do it in certain places, including Texas, North Carolina. It's just, you know, my district is a butterfly shape. Lloyd Doggett, for those of you that know Congressman Doggett, his district looks like a chicken finger, right? But I would say the same thing, you know. So I believe that we need to move to a system that you see in some red states and some blue states. In California, for example, but also in places like Iowa that are mostly Republican. I think that's a system that we ought to adopt.
Congressman, thank you for coming out. Question, being on the Foreign Affairs Committee, how do you make issues such as the ones that your committee cares about more of an interest to a lot of the American people? You have an audience here who cares about it, but that's not the majority of people. So when you go around, if you have domestic issues, there are a lot more people who care about it. How do you make these...
Yeah, y'all are part of the 1% here.
How do you make this more of an...
I mean the 1% that care about foreign affairs. Yeah, no, you're right. It's tough. But I'll tell you, I mean, the prospect of a nuclear war will get people's attention, right? And it certainly has. But I think, to answer your question, I think the important part is explaining to folks why, or making the case to folks why our relationships are important around the world, and why foreign aid, even though it represents such a small part of the budget, is so important. You know, it not just helps the societies or the countries that we're assisting, but also helps the United States. I've tried to do that. I tried to go back. I told the story. We opened up with where I grew up on the west side of San Antonio that I still represent. Just a million miles away from anything really having to do, except for maybe Mexico, Latin America a bit, but anything having to do with foreign affairs. I certainly didn't grow up in that world or that environment. But I've always tried to go and evangelize, so to speak, about the importance of it. Because if we don't do that, I think if all of us don't do that and speak about its importance, then it becomes easier for politicians in Congress to chip away at it, to chip away at things like foreign assistance. And the Global Development Lab, which is part of USAID, which I've done a lot of work with, that basically, crowdsources solutions to the nation's biggest, or not the nation's, the world's biggest development challenges. Comes up with incredible solutions. So I really just try to go out there and explain to people its role.
Thank you so much. It is recognized established power is Russia and rising power China. Rather than it's North Korea issue, so it's China Sea issue is serious in terms of a long-term view. So how does the U.S. government commit to a future equilibrium balance in Asia countries?
Economic balance?
It's economic and military, it's both sides.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, that's an interesting balance. Of course, China is our largest trading partner, incredibly important to our economy as we are to theirs. But we also have, obviously, military considerations and issues where our two nations disagree. For example, China was obviously very concerned about any kind of first strike with North Korea. In fact, they were also concerned about the further deployment of the THAAD missile defense system in South Korea. We also have issues with the militarization of islands in the South China Sea. Japan had the issue with the Senkaku Islands and the East China Sea. So we've got to be able to figure out a way where we still have a very productive and, in that sense, friendly economic relationship, but we also have to resolve these very thorny issues. And all of it, I think, happens mostly through diplomacy, as it should. But it's been interesting watching the past year because this North Korea issue, I think, has also brought folks together, nations together, in a way that you didn't necessarily have before this became such a pressing issue. One of the silver linings, if there is a silver lining, has been that we've been working with not just Japan and South Korea, but also with China on what could happen if something in North Korea does flare up. So that has been a silver lining. But China for a long time, I believe that China economically will continue to rise, that its prominence on the world stage will continue to grow, and that it will continue to be an important nation to the United States. But economically, China is also a rival for us. I see it as a competitor. I mean, we're in a very tough competition. And I think there's also, economically, there's also nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being a strong competitor against another country.
All right, Congressman, honored to have you here, and we're all delighted. When you mentioned, North Korea, if we think in terms of, what happened with Saddam and then with Gaddafi in Libya, the two of them, basically not achieving nuclear weapons. And if an autocratic regime sees nuclear weapons as an existential issue, is it perhaps long-term kind of unrealistic to expect, say, for North Korea to somehow, become denuclearize itself, remove its nuclear weapons, and instead, are we perhaps better to look in terms of ensuring the best ways to contain them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, the six-party talks failed. So far, at least rhetorically, North Korea has been committed to continuing to develop their nuclear arsenal. So there's a fair question to be asked, which is, listen, can you really denuclearize these guys? Can you really achieve that? That is a question right now, I think. That's the answer that we're searching for. And that's why I say I gave credit to the Trump administration for going to the UN, which means you're marshaling the world, not just the United States, but the cooperation of the Security Council and so forth, including China, and getting the toughest sanctions that North Korea has ever seen. That's something that the administration can be proud of and build upon. But without the cooperation of nations like Russia and China, the Southeast Asian nations, even some nations in Africa that do a small part of trading with North Korea, unless you're able to you really have to essentially bring them to a point economically where they're willing to come forward and actually sit down and talk about denuclearizing. And, and I can only hope, and I think all of us should hope, that the steps that they've taken in whatever small reconciliation this may represent with South Korea, right, or coming together, I can only hope, and we should hope, that that represents a first step in then coming to the table and ultimately in being willing to talk about denuclearization. But I don't think anybody can sit and say that, hey, I've looked into the future 10 or 15 years and I can say for sure that this is what's going to happen. But on the other hand, you know, a military attack on North Korea, you know that hundreds of thousands of people are likely going to perish, if not more. So that would be a certainty. You know, if we, and this is a determination that the administration would have to make, but in terms of containment, yeah, once you've figured out they're basically nuclear, then you need to figure out how do you contain that. And I still think that you maintain your economic pressure, and you could get to a point where you're negotiating essentially for denuclearization in order to fully allow them to be part of the world's economy, which they aren't now. So you all know, I mean, it's a very, all around, it's a very thorny and very tough issue to deal with. But I'm fairly confident of one thing, which is the solution will not come over Twitter or Facebook or any other social media enterprise. So,
if I could follow up to that, what do the North Koreans want? I mean, clearly they've got this as hopefully a means to an end. Is it to take over the world, or is it to blackmail people for money? But what does the intelligence community think their end game is? And what are they after?
well, let me speak from my understanding, because I don't want to give away classified information or be charged with giving away classified. But from my perspective, I think, look, if I had to give you my best assessment, I think you have a 32-year-old dictator, autocrat, who basically wants to be able to run his country and probably have enough prosperity to live the way Saddam Hussein and others lived, which is, you know, this lavish lifestyle, without being threatened by the United States or other countries. Does North Korea want to be a nation that, yeah, obviously they've made threats to the United States and South Korea before. How much of that is because, as you said, they want to be aggressive and actually go conquer other places? And how much of it is because this guy wants to feel like he's secure in his job there as the autocrat, and he's not having to worry about the United States or South Korea or anybody else, or China even, right, trying to replace him? I can say this, that we don't, even the intelligence community doesn't have all the answers to that. But I think whatever solution we come to, those are some of the questions that folks are asking.
All right, Congressman, we have time for one last
I just have one
question.
small question in that direction. I don't quite understand. I'm here. I don't quite understand our State Department's position in terms of diplomats. And this gentleman's question, what do North Koreans want, when we don't have a core over there talking to them, or even pushing forward the NATO paradigm? I mean, there's no conversation, and I'll tell you, I'm a Rachel Maddow fanatic.
Well, you may be missing her program.
Yes, I'm missing her program, but I can get it on Sling at 11. But we're not talking to them. I mean, the Korean analysts have said, the strategic analysts, we're not talking to them. We don't know who this autocrat is. We've made assumptions of who he is and what he may want. But how can we push a paradigm if we're not cultivating or having any form of diplomacy? And I don't understand, and maybe because my understanding is just so lay, why Congress is enabling this position from this administration.
Have you seen who serves in Congress up there? No, well, that's why I started with what I believe is true, which is our approach was not really diplomacy. Some folks who were very hawkish, who were basically implying that we should go to war with North Korea, they make the case that diplomacy failed. Well, I don't think we tried diplomacy, at least for the last dozen years or so. We really tried isolation. You try to basically completely isolate North Korea. So I believe that everything that we do at this point, like again, I give the administration credit on the sanctions, everything that we do needs to be aimed at getting them to the table to talk, to actually sit down and talk. From there, I think that you can see productive relationships perhaps in terms of more diplomacy. But I see that as a first step. In other words, I don't believe that before we sit down, we're going to go open, you know, an embassy in Pyongyang, right? First, there's going to be a sit down, and then from there, we can build upon that. But you're right, because otherwise your strategy is isolation, and there is a greater danger at that point if you don't fully understand who you're dealing with, and they don't understand you, and don't appreciate at least the arguments that each is making, that you're going to end up in war. And at this point, if we believe as we do that they have some degree of nuclear capabilities, even if perhaps their rockets couldn't hit the United States or their missiles, the mainland United States, they can still kill a lot of people close to them. And that's still obviously a big human problem.